Hi, what's up everybody? My name is Chris and today I want to talk to you about another lens that I just recently unboxed for the very first time. And that is actually the Canon RF 15 to 35 f2.8, which I hold in my hand right here. Now, I will, first of all, unbox this and show you how that whole process goes, and then I will talk to you about why I chose this lens to upgrade now, why I did so right next to upgrading to the 70-200 or adding the 70-200 to my lens kit, and also what I was using before in terms of the zoom that I had before, but also the limitations that I was experiencing with exactly that lens. But first, we are starting with the unboxing of the lens from this all the way to this. And first of all, we of course have a look at the box all around so you know how that looks. Once you start opening up this box, the first thing you will be greeted by is either paperwork or the pouch which you can use to package your camera gear or your lens into, and those are always really cool on those L glass lenses. Then moving forward, you have paperwork, which is like the license stuff and stuff like that. Then the lens is protected by styrofoam, and the next thing you have is the lens hood. That of course is always included when you have a L-mount lens, and moving forward you have the lens itself, again with styrofoam on the other side. Taking it out of its plastic bag, we are greeted by this beauty of a lens. It is really magnificent to hold the weight in a way, even though that also is a downside down the line as you have to carry it around. Then of course we have the front element and a look at the back, and of course also the rubber gasket. You can kind of see it right there. The interesting thing with these lenses that are stabilized is that there's actually a front element that is moving in certain lenses, and in some it actually parks when you shut down the camera. So that's something interesting. And then also there's an aspect about the zoom, which I will be talking about toward the end of the video, which is kind of confusing, that it actually retracts as you zoom to 35 instead of expand as you zoom to 35. So that's something there. Then, of course, attaching the lens hood, that has to have these cutouts because it is a wide-angle lens, and if it were not having those cutouts, those would, of course, produce a vignette. You can, of course, also reverse the lens hood so that you can store it away and just transport it. But I honestly have to say that I don't usually use those lens hoods, and they oftentimes even stay at home completely. Then, of course, you can package your lens into the pack, and of course also something that I don't usually use because I have my backpacks which are protection enough. Then the first thing that I actually do when I take it out of the packaging is that I actually attach a filter on top of the front element. Now there are debates whether or not that is useful or you should be doing that because it's a really expensive piece of lens, and of course you might not want to add anything bad in front of it. That's why I try to use really high quality filters. In this case those are B+W filters made in Germany as far as I know, and I just clean the lens front element and then of course also the inside of the filter, screw it on, and for that I usually screw the filter on backwards first and then wait until a click and then screw it all the way onto the lens. A quick cleanup of the front element and we are done, and the front element is completely protected against anything that could happen to it, and if something breaks there then it better be the filter instead of the front element of the actual lens. One last look and then I'm off to the races. Well, this lens right here, the 15 to 35, or better yet, the 16 to 35 f2.8, was kind of on my wish list since I started making videos, and especially since starting to also incorporate certain types of vlog content. However, for the time that I was actually doing video work and also vlog type content, the widest that I always had was something around 24 millimeters. And that's also what you can see here. This is a secondary angle that I have set up with a Canon EOS R and the 24-105. This is a f4 lens, which is the reason why the background is less blurry than, for example, with this here, because the usual angle that I work with here is the 35mm f1.8 macro STM lens. Now the 24-105 is by far not a bad lens, and even though it is f4, that also is still a very workable thing, especially for the type of video content that I create. As a kit starter lens for the Canon EOS R, it was incredible because it allows for a huge range at a reasonable cost, if you can say so, for an L lens, which costs around 1,000 euros. And of course, it gives you the flexibility to try and play around with a bit of a wider angle at 24mm and then also go into the realm of telephoto at 105. And the interesting thing is that in the past, 24 or rather 25 is actually also the area where I first did my bigger vlog content type stuff when I was traveling in America. And there I have the Zeiss Batiste 25mm. I think it was an f2 or f1.8 or something like that. And that of course was on the Sony E-mount with the Sony a7S Mark II as well as the a7S II. I had two lenses at the time, or rather three. Two of them were Batiste 25mm and then also the 85mm. And I had a Canon EF mount with an adapter, which was the 35mm 1.4. Now for vlogging, the Batiste lens 25mm was great. It was lightweight, it has great bokeh, it is really easy to travel with essentially. However, the problem is it is just 25mm. And the problem that I always ran into, and the problem that I now again ran into with the 24-105 is now if I have this and I want to hold this with my hand, I really have to stretch out my arm if I want to be able to vlog like this and hold the whole camera setup with an outstretched arm. That is, I think, one of the biggest limitations if you don't go wider than something like 24 or 25mm. Now, if you're on a crop factor, of course, there you might run into this limitation as well, because, for example, a 18mm with a 1.6 times crop is also something around 24 to 28mm, and so that is also a similar situation. If you, however, want to incorporate more of the surroundings that you have around you, then a wider angle lens, which gives you more of a incorporating or more of a GoPro type feel, a wide angle fisheye kind of situation, then you need something wider. In the past, when I was shooting with Canon for the first time before ever switching to Sony, I actually also had the, I think it was a Samyang 14mm f2.8. That was a fully manual lens, so the focus was manual, the aperture was manual, and of course it was a prime lens, so you could not zoom at all. And that lens was really interesting, and that has everything to do with the fact that that lens was extremely wide. It helped me get tons of different shots when I was doing a lot of HDR photography. But in the meantime, and for the past, I don't know, 8 years or so, I did not own anything wider than 24 or 25mm, except for, of course, working with a GoPro, for example, for those specialty shots. And now that leads me to this lens, back to this lens, because it has been on my vision board of sorts for years at this point. I always wanted one of these lenses because it is the lens that everybody always talks about or showcases when they're showing their video gear, specifically in terms of vloggers and those types of content creators, travel content creators, because it gives you the ability to incorporate way more of your surroundings whilst being a very versatile lens going all the way to 35mm, which, as you can see now, I am also using as my focal length for me talking to this camera. And in my opinion, I like 35mm a lot, otherwise I wouldn't have chosen this kind of prime lens for video shooting and stuff like that, despite it also being relatively inexpensive. But I prefer 35mm over, for example, a 50mm. 50mm are a bit more compressed. However, 35mm are set to be more of a normal person looking field of view kind of situation. And so that's what I also feel like feels very natural to shoot with. The camera is not all the way back or like super far away. It is kind of like a reaching distance, but it's still a reasonably nicely looking field of view. So that's the reason why I really like the 35mm. And that, of course, is a great combination because now here I have a super wide angle lens with 15mm and also have the 35mm for those full body portraits or those travel shots where you want to just take a bit of a landscape in and also be in the position of having a bit of a blurry background. And that's of course also where the 2.8 factor of this lens comes in. And in this case, I did not go for the 14-35 with an f4 because I want to have the ability to capture as much light as possible, have a bit of a more of a blurry background in the not so zoomed in modes, because of course with the 15-35 with the wide angle, if you are going down to 2.8, you don't get as much blur as you would have if, for example, you were to use a f2.8 at, let's say, 70 millimeters. And the same thing goes, by the way, for zooming in even further. So that's partly the reason why here with the 70-200, I actually chose the f4 because it is relatively lightweight comparing to the 2.8 version. And in the zoom, the 2.8 or the difference between 2.8 and 4, the blurriness in the background I found in the comparison shots not as staggering. And I will show you those kind of shots in upcoming videos because I am going to kind of give you an overview of what you can get from all the way with 15 millimeters, then zooming throughout the range with the 24-105 all the way up to 200 millimeters. And I might even do the comparison all the way up to something like 400 or 360 millimeters with the crop, which the Canon EOS R has on the 4K, which is about 1.8 times. So there's huge range from all the way to from 15 millimeters to something like 360, and showing you comparisons, how that changes the perspective, how that changes the background, the blurriness at an aperture of f4 all throughout the range, and with the 2.8 here on the longer end, maybe even including the 1.8 on the 35 millimeter. All of that is coming in upcoming videos. But for now, let's get back to this lens. You can see I clearly am kind of distracted by all the gear that I have and the ideas of videos that I want to bring to you to give you a better feel of what these can do, what the differences between these are, and maybe even help you decide on your buying or purchasing decision. Now, back to this. Everybody was talking about it. Everybody always has been using 15-35 or 16-35 millimeter lenses in the realm of content creators that I followed, specifically in the travel content creation, because there you really want to take in as much as you can from the surroundings. And that, of course, especially on something like a gimbal shot or a glide cam shot or stuff like that. And of course, also when you are doing the vlogging perspective, where you might have the lens right in your hand and just hold it out like this. And with this lens and this focal length, you can actually hold it at a bit of an angle right here. You don't necessarily have to have your hand in the shot or your arm, and you can still vlog like this. So that's a huge benefit that you have here. Now, something very interesting, if you are looking into these kind of lenses and you might want to look at the Canon EF version, if you have a EF mount camera, or you want to have an adapted version on the Canon EOS R, there are some things that you have to keep in mind there. There are about 4 different lenses from Canon in this specific range, from the 16-35 f2.8 and now with the RF 15-35 f2.8. What I want to have you be aware of is that some of the 16-35 EF versions at 2.8 are not image stabilized. And I think it is the third version of the 16-35 f2.8, which is the first one that actually was image stabilized. And of course, also the RF version here that I have in my hand is also image stabilized. And you have a lock or a mechanism here, and you can enable and disable the image stabilization. Of course, you also have the Canon EOS R digital stabilization, and with the R6 and the R5, if you have that, then you also have the internal stabilization inside of the camera. However, I have no experience with those because I only have the Canon EOS R camera here, and I am going to test this lens with those cameras that I have and not the ones that I don't. Now, it's quite remarkable to think that people were shooting vlogs on these types of lenses which were not image stabilized, but they were relatively wide angle. And nowadays, everybody wants everything even more stable than that was already. And I quite enjoyed the vlogs from 5 to 6 or 7 years ago, where people were using the lenses that are not stabilized and even in bodies that are not stabilized. So that's not really a big issue, I think. Some argue that the 15-35 has wobble at the end, specifically when you are going to the 15 millimeters. I will try to look for that when I do my tests and comparisons for a more in-depth video about this lens and what I learn about it, and also a kind of like a review type video. Now, to start wrapping this up, I want to give you my thoughts or initial thoughts on this lens as I was unpacking it. And first things first, I think it's a really well-built lens, but I already knew that from all the other stuff that I already have lying around here. The 24-105 is an L series lens, which is pretty much built exactly the same. So you have the multifunction wheel at the front here, then you have the focus, and of course the zoom. Now, something I found quite odd with this design, and I don't know if that's normal for these types of lenses or the other lenses in this realm, like the 16-35, the zoom works the other way around in terms of the retraction or expansion of the lens. I expected it to be at 15 millimeters when it is basically zoomed in. However, it's quite the opposite. So the normal traveling state is basically that you have it zoomed to 35 millimeters, and then as you zoom out, the lens actually extends a little bit. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily an issue. The only thing that I find a little bit confusing is that I will probably use the wider end more, and to me, it kind of felt unnatural to have it zoomed in at 35 millimeters and then zoom it out as you are using the 15 millimeters, which is the exact opposite of the 70-200 or even the 24-105, where here at 70 millimeters, you can actually lock it in place so it stays there. And this is basically the travel size. And then all the way at 200, it is the most extended. So that's what I found a little weird when I was first looking at this lens. And now something else I noticed with this lens is that it is huge. Comparing it to other lenses that I have, even comparing it to the 70-200. So the 70-200 is actually smaller than the 35-16 or 15-35. Now, this also means that the front element is actually also bigger, which I was aware of before purchasing, but at the end of the day, it still is something to be in consideration, because before that, I had my ND filters always at 77 millimeters and use step down rings to, for example, the 35 f1.8, which is a significantly smaller diameter for the front element. And here I actually had to get a new ND filter and a couple more step down rings so that I can use that ND filter on all of the lenses as well. But now I have a 82mm ND filter and a 77mm ND filter because I want to also be able to use them both at the same time. So I had to get one extra anyways. But yeah, so that's something to be in consideration. This is the biggest lens that I know has this filter thread. And of course, if you go all the way to the super telephoto lenses, you also have those big front elements with bigger filters. But this was something that was kind of new to me, to have a lens that is so huge in the front element. And overall, pretty big to all things considered. Now, of course, with Canon L glass, you always get a lens hood, and that's no different for this lens right here. You can just put that on like so, and I really like the mechanism that they made here with all of the lenses and the new lens hoods for the RF lenses, because you just screw it on and then it kind of sticks in place and you have a bit of a button to release this lens hood from the lens. Then of course also this lens is weather sealed, and you basically notice that mainly here at the end where you have a bit of a rubber gasket, and that of course goes hand in hand with the Canon EOS R, the RP, the R5, R6 and so on, which are all also weather sealed from what I know. Now something that I find rather odd in this case is that you don't have the locking mechanism that you have on the 70-200, where on the side you have a bit of a lock which you can lock the travel position. And on the 24-105, you also have a lock, so you can lock it in place at 24 millimeters. Here, you have nothing like that. So the lens just can extend or collapse, and you don't have the locking mechanism at all. Now, that might be because it just travels very little in terms of the extended version. If you compare this extension with the extension that you have with the 70-200, then it's a bit of a different story. So it might make sense that you can lock this and not that. But if they are locking all the other stuff, why not have a lock on this one? I'm not really sure about that. And now with all of this talking, and as a closing to this video, I want to give you the introduction of this lens, putting it onto the secondary body that I have right there. So I'm gonna just put this on there, screw it in place. I think it's at 35 right now, and now I'm switching to that. This is the view at 35 millimeters. This is a bit closer than the previous camera. So this is the 35 millimeters, which is about, I don't know, half a meter further away from me right now than the camera that I have here. As you can see, I can touch this, so I can still reach my camera here. And now the interesting thing is what happens if I actually zoom out. So now this is about at 24 millimeters, I think. Then we have, or no, this is 28 millimeters. Then we have 24 millimeters, which is marked on top of the camera. Then we have 20 millimeters, and you can see this is becoming really wide. And now we are all the way at 15 millimeters. This is a very different field of view from this camera right there, of course. As you can see, this looks really natural, or at least in my opinion, it looks really natural. And then if you have this, you have stretched out arms. It is kind of crazy how wide it is and how much you can see, but you can also see how things are stretched apart and look a bit more unnatural. But of course, that's part of the deal when you get something like a super wide angle like this kind of lens. And I think it's an amazing way to work with video in a completely different environment, in a different use case. And so this, I think, will be really cool because now I can reach this. You can see how close this actually can be. And I have tested this in my first vlogging experience recently, which I published, and you can check that out, of course, on my channel. And from the use there, I noticed that at 20 millimeters, I think that is probably going to be around the number where I see myself using it most in that kind of vlogging type situation, because this is not as extreme and as wide and looking like I'm as far away from the camera when I use this kind of setting. And of course, going back to 24, that is what I was able to do when I was using the 24-105 as my main vlogging kind of camera or a camera lens. And now this is what that would have been looking like. And back at 15 millimeters, I have the whole room captured, and that is kind of mind-bending to have that kind of option with this lens. And I'm really curious to see how this will help me capture more of what I'm doing, what I'm creating, and of course bringing you along and giving you the option to see more of the environment whenever that is appropriate. Now, I am really looking forward to bring along this camera more often, despite it being really heavy. But that just is the price that you pay if you want to have a certain quality level with, for example, bigger and wider lenses like this. Now, why did I buy this lens and this lens just about now? And that has everything to do with, of course, the upcoming project that I have, and of course also the expansion of my kit to be more versatile. I really want to play more with this type of focal length where I have the 200 millimeters, which I never really used that much because I never really had a lens in this area. But I also know that I really love to work with wide angle lenses for the type of video content, but also for example, videography and also photography of architecture, of travel, of landscapes, and having those kind of opportunities. So for me, in a way, the 70-200 and the 15-35 are kind of my two lenses that I always wanted to have in my kit. And that now is the case after years of working toward this kind of goal. And with a project that is now coming up and also bringing the financial opportunity to get this gear together and have the production quality that I really want to bring to this project in place, that's why I have brought all of this together now. And I hope for you, it is really interesting to see my journey with this type of equipment, how I am building out my kit, and also how I can create with those kind of things. And of course, also answer your questions if you have any. I think that's a good place to say that if you have any questions, you can leave those in the comment section down below. And if you found this video helpful, entertaining, or in any kind of way informative, I would appreciate a thumbs up or also a comment, of course. If you want to have a conversation about any of the topics that I talk about in the videos or this video specifically, of course, you can also join my Discord server, which will be linked in the description down below. Now, with all of that said, I think I'm done for this video for now. Sorry that it was a bit of a longer one, but I'm just super excited to have this here and I want to make more around it. but I also wanted to show you my first impressions and of course also my first thoughts about why I actually got this lens. And now when I start using it and I actually get more experience with it and also know more about the different use cases and the different situations where I find it really useful or what kind of results I get with it, then of course I will also include those in the upcoming ideas and of course in the upcoming review video that I want to make about this specific lens and the comparison and the showcase of what you can get if you have the full range from 15 all the way to 200 millimeters and how that can change your portraiture, your landscapes, what kind of effects those things have, and more. And now with that, I think it's time to wrap up this video. I hope to see you in the next one. And with all of that said, I hope you have an amazing day. Ciao, ciao.